Welcome to Jerusalem. In our journey following the footsteps of Jesus in the Holy Land, we've reached our final destination, Jerusalem. Now, to be precise, we're not yet in Jerusalem. We're on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a ridge which separates Jerusalem on one hand and the desert on the other hand. And you can now see behind me the Judean desert where we spent so much time before. Now, the Judean desert is a local desert. It's a very special one. It's not like the great deserts of the world, such as the Sahara Desert in Africa. It is a desert which was created because of the Mount of Olives. Clouds coming packed with water come from the sea, from the west, up to here. Here it rains, but once the clouds go beyond the ridge, down to the desert, they do not have enough water, and therefore this area remains dry. Now, the Mount of Olives is not just a mountain ridge. It is also a liminal concept. It has a concept of limit embedded into it. It is the limit, it is the border between the desert and the inhabited area, Jerusalem itself. It is also the limit or the boundary between death and life. It is also the limit between the ordinary people and the outcasts, the criminals, the prophets, the monks in the Byzantine era. If you do not belong to the ordinary society, you go to the Judean desert. If you flee from some danger, you go to the desert. So the desert, or to be specific, the Judean desert behind my back, is the backyard of Jerusalem. But our main question is, of course, what is the significance of the Mount of Olives in the history of Christianity? What does archaeology, tradition tell us about this ridge? Well, to answer that question, we must first explore the significance of the Mount of Olives in Judaism of the Second Temple period. Because remember, Jesus is a Jew. Let's go to explore the Mount of Olives. I'm now standing on the western side of the Mount of Olives. Now look around you and it looks totally different than the sight we had when we were standing on the eastern side looking at the desert. What you see behind me is ancient Jerusalem, and immediately behind that, the new city of Jerusalem. But at the focal point, at the center, we can clearly see the gilded dome, the Dome of the Rock, which is the center of the Temple Mount, but it is a Muslim structure. Back in the time of Jesus, this would be the place where the temple of the Jews would be standing. And that brings us back to the question of the importance of the Mount of Olives to the Jews in antiquity and later. The Mount of Olives is mentioned already in the Bible several times. The first time it is mentioned is in the time of King David. And then we hear about King David fleeing Jerusalem from his son, the rebel Absalom, and he's crossing the Mount of Olives, weeping, crying on his way to exile until he returns to take the city. Later, in the time of King Solomon, his son, this place will become a center of pagan cult. The wives of King Solomon will have the worship places here, worshiping idols and gods that they brought from home outside Jerusalem. Most importantly, in the Second Temple period, the Mount of Olives will be connected directly to the daily rite at the temple, to the daily life of Jews in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. Back then, in the Second Temple period, Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish people, but the Jewish people were not centered in the Holy Land. There were many, many people living in exile. And of course, the main problem would be back then how do you announce the new month? How do you announce the date of the festivities, of the holidays? And the idea was quite simple. When the holiday approaches, when the beginning of the new month approached, and that dictates the date of the holidays on that month, they would light signals, fire signals on the top of Mount of Olives, and through a chain of subsequent mountains, the signal will be delivered to the rest of the Jewish world. So this is actually a connecting concept in the Mount of Olives. We earlier spoke about the mountain being a division, a limit, a border between life and death, between the nomadic tribes in the desert and the cities on the western side. Now we can see that in the Second Temple period, the Mount of Olives is a connecting concept. It is a connection between the Jewish people in Jerusalem and the rest of the Jewish world abroad. It's quite interesting to note that in the Second Temple period, there's also an ideological, theological notion attached to the Mount of Olives. When the prophets such as Zechariah, and Ezekiel, Yechezkel, when they speak about the end of days, they also mention the Mount of Olives as the place where God will reveal himself, and the Mount of Olives will split into two, and a fountain of living water will gush out. So the Mount of Olives is deeply connected also in Jewish theology to the concept of end of days, of redemption. However, and that's quite interesting, until medieval times, until much later than the Second Temple period, no Jewish source mentions the Mount of Olives as the place of resurrection. That's quite interesting, because today, the main concept perhaps in the Messianic concept of Judaism about the Mount of Olives is the idea that in the end of days, indeed, people will resurrect on the Mount of Olives. This is the place of resurrection. That idea did not exist, as far as we can tell, in the Second Temple period. Certainly not in the time of Jesus. So this is something we should note. So we've discussed the importance of the Mount of Olives in Judaism in the Second Temple period, in the time of Jesus. But what is the significance of this place in Christianity in later years? Let us explore that too. I was born in Jerusalem, and yet, for me, even though I've been here thousands of times, this is still one of the most moving sites in the world. It's so emotional. And the site that we see now is quite different than the site as it would have looked in the time of Jesus in the end of the Second Temple period. For instance, when we look at the Temple Mount behind me, of course, the prominent building would be the temple, standing at the place where the dome, the gilded dome, is standing now. And of course, the city as we see it today would be quite different than the one in the Second Temple period. Think about the towers, the modern concrete buildings. They didn't exist back then. The one thing that did exist is the cemetery that we see down below here. This cemetery is a relatively modern, medieval and modern cemetery. This was always the necropolis, the city of the dead of Jerusalem throughout its history. In the time of Jesus, at the end of the Second Temple period, obviously the tombs would look differently, but there would be many, many tombs. We have found many of them in excavations, some of them still standing, and they're quite prominent. So this would be the necropolis, and beyond that, the valley of Kidron, and beyond that, the city. So we are here in the city of the dead, and over there, it's the city of the living in the Second Temple period. And when we think about the significance of this site in the beginning and in later times in the development of Christianity, we see that there's a major shift compared to what happened here during the Second Temple period. In the Second Temple period, as we said, It's mostly focused on the historical events, the Jewish law, the signaling to the diaspora about the date of the new month and the holidays, and of course the theological issue of the end of days. But now when we speak about early Christianity, we're focusing more on one simple story, the final week in the life of Jesus. This is the main story. And especially in early Christianity, in the Byzantine period, in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, when we discuss the Mount of Olives, it is linked to the story of the ascension of Jesus. As we all remember, according to the Gospels, Jesus was crucified, later he was buried, and then he resurrected on Sunday, and 40 days later, he goes up to heaven. That happens where? Well, it happens according to tradition right here on the Mount of Olives. When we think about the concept of the ascension of Jesus here on the Mount of Olives in early Christianity, it's worth noticing that there's a parallel tradition also in Judaism, not about Jesus, of course, but about the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah, it's a Jewish term, it's a Hebrew Jewish term. It means the presence of God on earth. And the idea is, according to the sages, in the Byzantine era, in the first centuries after the destruction of the temple, the idea is that the Shekhinah was always in the temple. But once the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD by Titus, the Roman general, at that point the Shekhinah left the temple and moved to the Mount of Olives. For how long? For 3.5 years. And from here, the Shekhinah went up back to heaven. So in Jewish concept, this is the Mount of Olives is the last place where God was present before the rise to heaven. You see the similarity between the idea of ascension in Christianity and the idea of the divine presence on earth, leaving earth at this precise point. Scholars are divided as to the historical relation between these two concepts. Some claim that the Christian concept of ascension was influenced by the Jewish concept of the ascension of the Shekhinah from this place. Because Jesus was a Jew and the first apostles, the apostles were Jews, many of them, not all of them. It makes sense. However, some scholars recently claim that it's the opposite. That is, first there was the Christian concept of the ascension from the Mount of Olives, and only then came the response, the Jewish response saying that, no, it's not Jesus who ascended to heaven from here. It's actually the divine presence, the Shekhinah. So in this sense, it may be a polemic issue here. It's an idea of a disagreement between early Judaism and early Christianity. But the ascension idea is not the only concept which is linked to the Mount of Olives in early Christianity. There are different events in the life of Jesus that are associated with the Mount of Olives or its surroundings. Think, for instance, about the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus actually lived on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives. And when he died, Jesus comes and resurrects him. It happens on the Mount of Olives. Again, the concept of resurrection linked to the Mount of Olives. Another story about Jesus in the New Testament is about him coming down from the Mount of Olives, going down to Jerusalem, to the temple behind me. And when he does that, he foresees the destruction of the temple, and he weeps, knowing what's going to happen. Now, this is also an interesting concept. Think about King David. I told you earlier that in the first mention, the first record of the Mount of Olives, or the Olive Ascent, as it is called in the Bible, and the Bible tells us that when David flees Jerusalem, he goes up on the Mount of Olives and he weeps. Now comes Jesus, the son of David, according to the Gospels, and he weeps going down when he sees Jerusalem. You can see the theological connection between these two ideas. But in the Gospels, the Mount of Olives is also linked to the story about the last hours of Jesus on earth. And that happens, according to tradition, in a place called Gethsemane. In Hebrew, Gat Shmanim. Let's go and explore the site of Gethsemane. I'm here at a place called Gethsemane, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, next to the valley of Kidron, and not too far from the Temple Mount. We're to the east of ancient Jerusalem. And you can hear it's quite busy here. Noises of cars going by, buses, tourists, and so on and so forth. I can assure you, this was definitely not the situation at the end of the Second Temple period in the time of Jesus. Now, the name of the place is Gethsemane. And the question is, what exactly does it mean? In Hebrew, Gethsemane is Gat Shmanim. What is Gat? Gat is a place where one produces wine. So it's a wine press. What is Shmanim? Shemen in Hebrew means oil. Okay, so that's olive press. But wait a second. The combination Gat Shmanim cannot exist actually, because it means nothing. It's either olive press or a wine press. So we have a problem here. Problem is that we find this term in the New Testament, in the Gospels. And there we have it in Greek, which is the international language spoken back then by almost everyone in the Middle East. So when we reconstruct the term from Greek to Hebrew, we get something that doesn't make sense. So maybe we misread it. Maybe we misconstrued it. Maybe Gethsemane in Greek doesn't mean Gat Shmanim, but rather Gad Shmanim. Now, I know it sounds very similar for those of you who do not speak Hebrew, but Gad Shmanim means something totally different. Gad Shmanim means the bank of the oil. Bank, not in the sense of a bank where you get your money, bank in the sense of a valley that has two banks. Okay, so this is the deepest part of the valley. We have the one bank here, another bank here, the bank of the oil. What does it mean? The place where we have oil. But wait a second, do we have oil in nature? Of course not. It means probably the place where olive trees grow. Now that makes sense, as indeed this place is known as, in the Bible, as the ascent of the olives, already in the time of David, as we've mentioned earlier. And indeed, till this day, there are so many olive trees in this region, and you can see some of them, they're not that old, but they're over here in front of us in the valley of Kidron. Mentioning that, the question, of course, would be, what else do we have here from the time of the Second Temple? Are there any archaeological remains? Well, yes, of course there are, and quite a lot. For instance, if you look over there to the south, you can clearly see the famous tomb of Absalom, a tomb which is definitely from the Second Temple period in the valley of Kidron. There are other tombs there too. The tombs we see down below here belong to the Franciscans, the Catholics here in Jerusalem. But an excavation conducted here a couple of years ago found something quite interesting, a Jewish ritual bath, or a mikveh, as it is known in Hebrew. A mikveh is a ritual bath used by Jews, even today, to purify themselves. So what we have here is clear evidence of tombs, burials from the Second Temple period, and of a ritual bath, a Jewish ritual bath from that period, from the end of the Second Temple period, from the time of Jesus. Inside the area of the church, we will see some more interesting things. So let's go there and explore what's in Gethsemane Church. Here, inside the courtyard of the Church of Gethsemane, we can see more archaeological remains, but from a later date. We've discussed the Second Temple period. Now, we can see remains from the Byzantine period and the Crusader period. In those periods, there were two churches built here to commemorate something. Not only that, the modern church that we're going to see in a moment was built in 1924 by an architect called Antonio Barluzzi. It belongs to the Franciscan order in Jerusalem. They represented the interests of the Catholics here for hundreds of years until the middle of the 19th century, and they own this place till today. And it's, for them, one of the most important sites in Jerusalem, religiously speaking. So they built here the church in 1924, and they gave it three names. One is Gethsemane Church. Two is the Church of the Agony, the suffering. And three, the Church of All Nations. All nations meaning it's named after the nations, the Catholic nations that donated the money to build this church in 1924. So obviously there's much importance in this church. And the question is, why was this church erected here? Why were there a Crusader church and a Byzantine church? Something of importance must have been here in antiquity. Let us now go into the church and explore that. I'm now inside the Church of Gethsemane, or the Church of Agony. And this is the place where we can finally answer the question, what is the significance of this place in the history of Christianity? Well, the answer actually lies directly ahead of you if you look at the apse, the great painted niche at the rear of the church. It faces east. And on it, you can see a huge, colorful picture showing a man leaning on bedrock. He looks like he's in a mood of prayer. This is Jesus. And this is the story of Jesus in Gethsemane. That story is told in the Gospels, where we read that immediately after the Last Supper, Jesus, who knows that he is going to be betrayed by Judas Iscariot, now goes with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, which is identified by tradition with this place, at least since the Byzantine era. When he stands here, it's night already. He prays here, and he asks his disciple to remain with him, to pray with him, to stay awake. But they can't, and they fall asleep. He remains alone, agonizing, suffering, knowing what's going to happen, knowing that the crucifixion and death are near. He actually sweats large drops of blood, according to the Gospels. And suddenly, the Roman guardians, the slaves of the high priest, they all come, following Judas Iscariot, who comes to Jesus, hugs him, and kisses him. This is the signal that he is the man they should arrest. Jesus is arrested, and he's now taken to his trial and to his crucifixion. That scene, by the way, can be seen on the right-hand side apse. You can see there the slaves of the high priest and the Roman soldiers approaching Jesus, and Judas is about to kiss him and turn him over to the Romans. The design of this church was done by an architect. I mentioned him earlier. His name is Antonio Barluzzi. He built and designed many buildings of the Franciscans in the Holy Land. But there's something special I'd like to show you, which you can actually see when you visit this church. Come with me. Look around you. It's truly a magnificent building. The architecture here reflects the basic design of a basilica. That is a large hall divided into three parts. The main part, the nave, is slightly broader and higher, and the aisles are smaller and less broad than the middle nave. The general feel, the atmosphere here is a bit stressed, I'd say. It's stressful. You almost feel the agony. And the architect used a very simple method to achieve that. The church is not lit properly. There's not enough light. This is to reflect the idea that we're in the night and Jesus is now praying on the rock that is exposed in front of the main apse. So you have the sense of night here, of contemplation, prayer. And if you look at the floor, you'll see something interesting. The floor is actually in a design that follows Byzantine patterns. Why is that? Well, you may think perhaps because Barluzzi wanted to connect himself to the idea of the first churches in the Middle East, which is fine. It's probably also true. But there's more to it. Because when you move a little bit back, you will see here a little window in the floor. And next to it, another one. And there's more. What are these windows doing here? If you look carefully inside, you can clearly see the same pattern of the mosaic floor inside the window. The idea is very simple. What you see here is a Byzantine mosaic floor belonging to the original church that was built here in the Byzantine era. Now, when Barluzzi designed this building, he didn't know he's going to find this. So he designed a basilica, he designed a building with another type of floor, and suddenly, lo and behold, they found this floor. So what he did is two things. Firstly, he changed the entire orientation of the church so that it would fit, it would sit on the lines of the Byzantine church, so as to stress the continuity between the past, the Christian past, and the Christian present. And in addition, he imitated the style of the original mosaics in the new mosaics. In this, he achieved, as I said, the continuity between ancient and modern Christianity in this beautiful church. Many times people ask me, is there anything here that we can see that actually belongs to the Second Temple period? My simple answer is, of course, the bedrock. It never changes, right? But there's more to it. Local tradition says that the trees that we see here, right behind my back, are olive trees, perhaps already from the time of Jesus. Is this possible? Well, I'll tell you that it is almost impossible to date olive trees. But we have one method that could be of assistance, and this is the estimation of the thickness of the olive tree. The older the olive tree is, the thicker it is. The younger it is, the narrower it is. This is a general rule, I think, one can accept. And judging by the size of these trees, and some of them do look very, very old, judging by the size, they're about 500 to maybe 800 years old, according to different estimates. But they're certainly not 2,000 years old. So unfortunately, these trees are quite late in comparison to the date of the stories of Jesus that are 2,000 years old. The trees here are mentioned for the first time in written sources about 500 years ago. So the historical records indeed fit the botanical estimate that they are about 500 to 800 years old and probably not beyond that.